I can just imagine on that day, June 7th, when a lawyer is confronted and confesses to having stolen over $500,000 from a client, and he has a tiger like Mark Tinsley on his tail pursuing discovery in the case involving the death of Mallory Beach, and having a father, for the most part, on his deathbed. I could imagine, or really can't imagine, but I know it had to have been quite a bit going through your mind on that day. But amazingly, to have you come and testify that it was just another ordinary day, that my wife and son and I were out just enjoying life. Not credible, not believable. You can convince yourself about it, but obviously you have the inability to convince anyone else about that. So if you made any such arguments as a lawyer, you would lose every case like that. Cases you will never have an opportunity to argue anymore, except perhaps your own as you sit in the Department of Corrections. Anything further?
No, sir.
All right, Mr. Murdaugh, I sentence you to the State Department of Corrections on each of the murder indictments in the murder of your wife, Maggie Murdaugh. I sentence you for a term of the rest of your natural life for the murder of Paul Murdaugh, whom you probably loved so much. I sentence you to prison for murdering him for the rest of your natural life. Those sentences will run consecutive. Under the statute involving possession of a weapon during a violent crime, there is no sentence where a life sentence is imposed on other indictments. That is the sentence of the court, and you are remanded to the State Department of Corrections. And officers may carry forth on the imposition. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
All right, so there you have it. Alex Murdaugh, who was convicted of killing his wife and son in 2021, sentenced to 2 life sentences for those murders. There was an additional charge associated with the weapon, but with 2 life sentences, there was no need to impose a sentence on that. We want to bring in Vinu Varghese, who's been standing by with us. He's a defense attorney and former prosecutor, also a visiting faculty member at Harvard Law School's Trial Advocacy Workshop.
Unlock the darkest stories and unravel the mysteries with Dark Crime Box. Subscribe now and step inside the world of true crime like never before.
Before we step inside the cold concrete walls of a maximum security prison, before the steel doors slam shut, before power, privilege, and legacy mean absolutely nothing, I want to pause for a moment. To everyone watching this video, to every subscriber who has stood by this channel, who listens closely, who shares these stories, who keeps the truth alive, I appreciate you more than words can express. This channel exists because of you. Your support, your comments, your patience, they mean everything. Dark Crime Box is not just a channel. It's a community that refuses to look away from the darkest truths. And for that, thank you. Now, let's begin. Starts not with a scream, but with silence. The kind of silence that settles over a place long after something unspeakable has happened. On a quiet summer night in rural South Carolina, the ground beneath a hunting lodge absorbed blood that should never have been spilled. The air carried the echo of gunshots that shattered a family legacy built over generations. By the time authorities arrived, 2 bodies lay motionless, a mother and a son, their lives violently erased in a place that once symbolized safety, wealth, and control. At the center of it all stood a man who, for decades, had been untouchable. Alex Murdaugh, a name that once opened doors, a name that commanded respect in courtrooms, police stations, and political offices. A name woven into the justice system so tightly that many believed it was the justice system. But power has a way of collapsing inward. As investigators peeled back the layers, they didn't just uncover a double murder. They exposed a collapse of morality that stretched back years. Financial crimes buried under prestige. Lies hidden behind legal authority. A dynasty rotting from the inside. When the verdict finally came down, it wasn't just a conviction. It was exile. Alex Murdaugh was no longer a respected attorney. No longer a pillar of the community. No longer protected by his last name. He was now inmate number assigned by the state. And prison does not care who you used to be. The first days inside were not dramatic. There were no cameras. No speeches. No sense of closure. Just the slow, suffocating realization that this was permanent. A concrete intake area. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Personal belongings stripped away one item at a time. Shoes replaced. Clothes exchanged. Identity erased. Every movement monitored. Every breath accounted for. For a man who once dictated outcomes in courtrooms, the loss of control was immediate and absolute. Doors opened only when someone else allowed them to. Meals arrived when someone else decided. Sleep came under the watchful eye of cameras and guards who knew exactly who he was, and exactly what he had done. Inside prison walls, reputation travels faster than paperwork. Other inmates didn't need introductions. They already knew his name. They knew the crimes. They knew the headlines. And most importantly, they knew that outside power meant nothing here. In prison, there is only hierarchy. And Alex Murdaugh entered at the bottom. Every glance carried weight. Every footstep echoed with threat. In a place where weakness is currency and fear is survival, his presence was not respected. It was resented. Some inmates saw him as a symbol of corruption. Others saw him as a target. And some saw opportunity. Even guards kept their distance. Not out of fear but caution. Because housing a high-profile inmate comes with risk. Any altercation, any injury, any unexplained incident would invite scrutiny. And in prison, scrutiny is dangerous. So he was watched. Closely. Constantly. But never comforted. Isolation followed quickly. Protective custody became less of a safeguard and more of a sentence within a sentence. Long hours alone. Minimal contact. Silence broken only by distant echoes of shouting, metal clanging, and the occasional alarm reminding him that violence was never far away. This was not the prison he imagined. This was not the punishment he prepared for. This was a slow psychological dismantling. And this was only the beginning. Prison does not operate on paper rules alone. There is a second system, older, darker, and far more dangerous. Unwritten rules. They are not posted on walls. They are not explained during intake. But everyone inside learns them quickly, or they don't last. The first rule is silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of curiosity. You don't ask questions. You don't look too long. You don't react when violence erupts a few feet away. In prison, awareness can get you noticed, and being noticed can get you hurt. Alex Murdaugh entered a world where attention was liability. His name carried weight, but not the kind that protects. Inmates recognized him not as a lawyer, but as a man who once stood above consequences. To many, that made him a symbol of everything they hated about the system that put them there. The The second rule is allegiance. Every prison has invisible borders. Lines drawn not on the floor, but in blood and reputation. Racial divisions. Quiet power structures enforced through fear. Even those who claim no affiliation are still expected to understand where they stand. Alex stood nowhere. Protective custody kept him physically separated, but socially isolated. He wasn't part of any group. He didn't belong. And in prison, not belonging is dangerous. The third rule is humility. You don't boast. You don't explain who you used to be. You don't reference your past life unless you want it used against you. For a man whose entire identity was built on status, this rule cut deepest. Inside, credentials mean nothing. Education doesn't intimidate. Wealth doesn't impress. And legal knowledge doesn't save you when the doors lock behind you. Any sign of arrogance, real or perceived, is interpreted as weakness. And weakness invites testing. The fourth rule is patience. Nothing happens quickly in prison. Time stretches until days blur together. The frustration builds and many inmates crack under its weight. Some lash out. Some self-destruct. Some become numb. Alex Murdaugh learned quickly that impatience only made things worse. Complaints didn't bring relief, they brought attention. And attention in this environment was something he could not afford. The fifth rule is survival through invisibility. The safest inmate is the one nobody remembers. But invisibility is impossible when your case is infamous. Other inmates watched him carefully, not aggressively at first, more like predators studying unfamiliar prey. They noticed his routines, his posture, his guarded movements. They watched how guards interacted with him differently, how doors opened slightly faster, how officers stayed closer than usual. In prison, difference creates suspicion, and suspicion creates danger. Whispers spread, not loud enough to hear clearly, but loud enough to feel. Stories grew distorted as they passed from cell to cell. Some saw him as protected. Others believed he had privileges. And in prison mythology, perceived advantage is often enough to justify retaliation. Alex Murdaugh didn't need to break a rule to be in danger. Simply existing as who he was enough. This was no longer about justice or guilt. This was about power shifting hands. And in this place, power is taken, not given. As days turned into weeks, the tension didn't fade. Thickened. Every meal tray slid through the slot carried uncertainty. Every walk down the corridor came with the knowledge that one wrong moment, one lapse in attention, could trigger consequences no guard could stop in time. This was the psychological pressure prison applies slowly, deliberately, without mercy. A constant reminder that the rules you lived by outside no longer apply. And for Alex Murdaugh, the unwritten rules were already closing in. Power inside a prison does not always come from fists or gangs. Sometimes it comes from keys. Correctional officers control the most important things an inmate can never reach. Doors, schedules, movement, and silence. They decide when lights go out, when meals arrive, when isolation begins, and when it ends. And for inmates like Alex Murdaugh, their presence was both protection and warning. From the moment he entered custody, guards knew exactly who he was. They had seen the headlines. They had followed the trial. They understood the attention his name attracted from the public, from the media, and from the inmates watching closely. But knowing someone's story doesn't mean sympathy. It means caution. Officers did not joke with him. They did not engage. They did not linger longer than necessary. Every interaction was measured, short, controlled. Not because he was feared, but because he was volatile in a different way. Any incident involving a high-profile inmate becomes a problem no one wants their name attached to. An injury, a fight, a claim of mistreatment. Even a rumor could spiral into investigations, lawsuits, or national scrutiny. So the safest approach was distance. Professional distance. Guards watched him more closely than others, but spoke to him less. They moved him carefully through shared spaces. They timed his movements to avoid contact when possible. Not to protect him as a person, but to manage risk. In prison, protection does not feel like safety. It feels like isolation. Alex Murdaugh became a presence constantly monitored, yet profoundly alone. Guards kept eyes on him but not companionship. Authority without comfort. Surveillance without support. And inmates noticed. They noticed how officers stayed alert when he passed. They noticed how routines shifted around his movements. They noticed the invisible bubble forming around him. In prison, perceived favoritism can be as dangerous as hostility. Some inmates interpreted the distance as privilege. Others saw it as weakness disguised as protection. A man separated from the population becomes a mystery, and mysteries are tempting. Guards knew this. That's why they kept him moving. Limited exposure. Minimal contact. But this approach came with its own cost. Because distance from guards also meant distance from help. If something happened quickly, too quickly, response time could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. And inside prison walls, seconds matter. The silence between officer rounds grew louder. The absence of casual supervision left room for imagination and fear. Every sound echoed differently when no one was nearby. Every movement outside the cell became a potential threat. This wasn't neglect. It was calculated control. A balance between preventing harm and avoiding involvement. And for Alex Murdaugh, that balance felt razor-thin. The man who once relied on law enforcement as allies now lived under their watch. Not as a peer, not as a partner, but as a liability. He was no longer someone to protect. He was someone to manage. And management in prison has no room for empathy. Only outcomes. Threats in prison do not always arrive loudly. Most of the time, they come quietly. A look held a second too long. Footsteps slowing behind him. A sudden silence when he enters a space. For Alex Murdaugh, danger didn't announce itself. It circled. Inside the prison ecosystem, information is currency. And his story was worth a lot. Inmates traded details and fragments, what they'd heard, what they believed, what they imagined. Facts blurred quickly into rumor, and rumor hardened into motive. To some, he represented privilege finally stripped away. To others, betrayal of blood. To others still, an opportunity to gain reputation by testing a high-profile name. In prison culture, status is earned through dominance. Hurting the right person can elevate someone overnight. And Alex Murdaugh was the right person. He carried the kind of notoriety that could shift power dynamics. Any confrontation involving him would ripple through the facility. And everyone knew it. Protective custody reduced exposure, but it did not eliminate threat. It simply changed its shape. Instead of open hostility, danger arrived through proximity. Moments when routines overlapped, when timing failed, when systems stretched thin, nowhere to escape. For a man once surrounded by influence, this becomes the most brutal sentence of all. Inside isolation, time loses meaning. Days are marked not by events, but by their absence. Movement happens under escort. The world narrows to concrete, steel, and thought. This is where prison finishes what served. The question is this: is living the rest of your life stripped of power, isolated, watched, and remembered only for your worst act? A punishment worse than death? Let me know what you think in the comments. If the story moved you, disturbed you, or made you think. Support Dark Crime Box by liking this video, sharing it with others, subscribing to the channel, and turning on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Your support keeps these stories alive. And as always, some crimes don't end at sentencing. They just begin behind bars.